The year is 1872, the month is February, and the second book of George Eliot's Middlemarch, Old and Young, has hit the bookstands in recent weeks. And what a perfect day it is to speak to you about this tremendous volume, as I look out my window and I see the debris of England's most recent storms. Indeed, you might hear the wind kicking up and the rain lashing against the window, and in this way I feel a sense of connection to that first reader coming to the second volume of Middlemarch for the first time in 1872. The previous year was bitter cold, the coldest on record, and this year would become wet to the point of agricultural crisis. And whilst the wind and rain have provided the soundtrack to my personal rereading of this volume, you might wish to return to your favourite passages whilst listening to a different soundtrack. I've compiled a little listening programme for you to enjoy, sourcing out some great recordings of the songs that comprise part of Rosamond's musical repertoire. We have an English canzonet from Haydn, and ambitious listeners might wish to indulge in the great composer's Messiah at some point. We know that Mary Ann Evans herself frequently went to concerts and particularly enjoyed Haydn. We have an aria from Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, and we have an aria from Don Giovanni. We have Sweet William's Farewell to Black-Eyed Susan, and I have also sourced music from an Aeolian harp for you, the rationale for which will become apparent over the course of this lecture. Book 2 is called Old and Young, though indeed over the course of your reading and rereading, you might discover some potential alternative titles. Throughout the course of this book, divisions are starkly apparent. You might think it more apt to rename this second book, or you might think that George Eliot could have renamed it Old versus Young, as opposed to Old and Young. Old versus Young. It could also be titled according to the thematic divisions which George Eliot threads throughout the course of this novel. Art versus science. Fact versus feeling. I believe it is in this second book that becomes all the more apparent that Middlemarch grew out of what had originally been planned as two separate narratives. We know that Miss Brooke had originally been intended as a short story or a short fiction, perhaps a novella, and we know that the book Middlemarch had originally been focused on Tertius Lydgate. But over the course of the composition period, Mary Ann Evans had a stroke of genius and realised that these were two narratives in the same work. They were part of the same universe, they were exploring very similar and complementary ideas, and that it would really be best to weave them together. And I deploy that word weave quite deliberately, because that is a word and that is a preoccupation that George Eliot is rather obsessed with, this idea of webs and weaving, nodes being connected, how individuals in a society exert their influence upon one another and feel the influence of others upon them. When I reread Middlemarch, I continually think, thank goodness George Eliot decided to weave these two narratives together. The result is one of the greatest novels in the English language. I would personally contest it to be the greatest novel alongside Moby Dick. We're grateful today for the complex, layered, multi-plot narrative that we have before us. But keep in mind also that Middlemarch very nearly was not born at all, whether as one big novel or two separate stories. A year or so before Eliot started deliberating about the characters and stories of Middlemarch, she was giving serious thought to the composition of an epic poem across multiple books about the life of the general Timoleon of Corinth, whose life was detailed and Eliot would have enjoyed reading about in Plutarch. Eliot was interested in exploring, in her own words, the influence of personal character on the destinies. The influence of personal character on the destinies. Well, we know that when we visit the theatre to see a high tragedy, whether by Shakespeare or whether by Aeschylus, we know that that is what we are going to be treated to. An examination, an exploration of the influence of personal character on the destinies. Typically, there is one central character flaw that leads to a great man or woman's tragic downfall. And yet, we would see that Eliot would carry this interest over into Middlemarch. I find Eliot's prose to be very poetic in places, stylistically, but most thoroughly in sentiment. Her sentiment is poetic. But I see her voice as being one that is more crisply analytical, scientific, essay-like than melodious. Had she forged ahead with this poem, perhaps we would have had a Victorian period piece that was an amalgamation of Virgil and Milton. We know that Eliot had immersed herself in her work, studying in much the same vein as Casaubon, who we see in this book tires out poor Dorothea with his note-taking for the key to all mythologies. Somewhere along the line, we see that Eliot's interests shifted from classical epic to an epic of contemporary life, or at least an ambitious exploration of the not-too-distant past, the England of George Eliot's childhood. Tracing the impetus of a work of genius is no easy thing to do. Of course, for an artist, it's not as simple as just deciding one day to abandon that epic poem that we're researching and writing, and we're going to abandon that epic poem in favour of let's say, a multi-plot, psychologically complex realist novel. We know it's not that simple. We see that birthing a novel like Middlemarch comes out of the writer's entire life. We know that in 1869, the same year Eliot was researching the epic poem that never was, George Henry Lewes, Eliot's partner and husband in all but name and legality, we know that he was struggling to look after his son, who would die that year of spinal tuberculosis at the tragically young age of 25. And we cannot emphasise enough just how thoroughly the death of the young Thornton Lewes affected them both. We know from the journals of George Henry Lewes that he considered all of 1869 a wasted year. That's what he said. It was a wasted year. George Eliot and he would go on to develop their lifelong thirst of scientific knowledge in the wake of Thornton's death. And I cannot help but think of the Shelleys, Percy Bysshe and Mary, who would develop their interests in galvanism and reanimation in the wake of their own tragedy, the birthing of a stillborn, the trauma of which can be felt in every single line of Frankenstein. In 1870, the year after the death of Thornton, George Henry Lewes and George Eliot would visit Oxford to watch an anatomy of the brain. For years, the couple would indulge an evening routine that involved Eliot reading aloud from the latest scientific journals and research, difficult German textbooks, and we know that they both read and enjoyed Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, the year it came out in 1859, also the year of Eliot's first novel, Adam Bede. We know that Lewes developed a great interest in cell or tissue theory, inspired by Xavier Bichat, a French physician and pathologist known as the father of modern histology or microanatomy. Bichat distinguished 21 types of elementary tissue from which human organs are composed. Bichatian tissue theory led to the rise of hospital doctors, and we see the great physician would inspire not only Tertius Lydgate, whom we get to know more thoroughly in the beginning of Book 2, but the extended metaphors of webs, tissues, weaving, and connection that keeps Middlemarch together. George Eliot, in 1876, would write that she saw her fiction as simply a set of experiments in life. Indeed, this viewpoint comes as no surprise to anyone who has marked the subtitle of her masterpiece, A Study of Provincial Life. In July of 1871, 5 months before the first instalment of Middlemarch and 7 months before this second book, Eliot, in a letter to Blackwood, writes, "I don't see how I can leave anything out, because I hope there is nothing that will be seen to be irrelevant to my design, which is to show the gradual action of ordinary causes rather than exceptional, and to show this in some directions which have not been, from time immemorial, the beaten path." Henry James, perhaps jealously, would go on to base his primary criticisms of Middlemarch, one of those baggy monsters that Tolstoy also liked to indulge in, as precisely not leaving anything out. James saw too many extraneous details that could have been excised from the work. And though Henry James is a great writer in his own right, I feel confident enough to say that his criticism of Middlemarch is proof only of the fact that writers can often make the worst readers. Every single detail in Middlemarch is relevant. And yes, there are a lot of them. If one has ever looked at a web, or indeed cell tissue, under the microscope, one is already convinced of the intricate interplay between all of these subtle connections. Eliot gifts us the book on the age of reform. It is the book of reform. And we know that reform, despite sounding rather abstract, is not a solitary force that came into effect on a specific date and thereafter altered the course of history, but reform is rather thousands of small decisions, thoughts, insights, conversations, discoveries, movements, crises that take place all across the land on the individual level. And all of these small details, cascades of reforms, great and small, they all add up to define an era. There was no way that Middlemarch could have been written better. It is, for all its details, a perfect novel. Old and Young opens with our getting to know Tertius Lydgate better. If I were a first reader, I would personally find myself eager to check in on Dorothea and Casaubon. I would have spent the last 2 months wondering how their honeymoon was going. And yet, we open here with Lydgate, further delaying the plot line of the character who is our introduction to the world. You'll recall, of course, that Book 1, Miss Brooke, opens with Dorothea Brooke, who is an idealistic young woman concerned with 2 things primarily: drawing up plans for cottages, and inherent in that is her own personally felt wish to reform renting across the land. And she is also concerned with marrying the Reverend Edward Casaubon, who she believes, being older and therefore wiser, she believes he will be able to offer her guidance and channel her idealistic impulses. She also hopes to be an aid to a great man like Locke or Milton, and to help Casaubon in his composition of his book on mythology. We wonder what's happening with these two, don't we? But we open with Tertius Lydgate, and with every rereading of Middlemarch, I find my appreciation of the Lydgate storyline deepening. So, what do we learn about Tertius Lydgate? We learn that he is 27 years old, so he's young, but not too young. He is now coming into a new cycle in his life. As you may be aware, our brains continue developing until the age of 25. Add fluctuating hormonal balance and a natural proclivity to mature at a slower rate than women, and it's no surprise why a man in his early 20s is seen as still very much a young'un, and may have his work cut out for him when it comes to being part of the new vanguard leading the way. He'll find that obstacles come in the form of the older generation, who are still firmly established at this point, potentially set in their ways and resistant to change, resistant to reform, and suspicious of young blood. And why not? Why shouldn't they be suspicious of young blood? The young'uns don't have the lived experience that they do. But, on the other hand, the world is also not the same place that it was when the older generation were themselves young. And, of course, they would have found themselves in conflict with the generation that they were to succeed. There's a whiff of old authority and nepotism in the air in this provincial world, but whilst Lydgate is young, he's not too young. He's not naive, which we might feel is a descriptor that would apply to Dorothea in Book 1. Lydgate is transitioning to a state of maturity, and he is seeking to establish himself. He is brimming with ambition. Lydgate is a new young surgeon from an upper-class background. Keep in mind that his stepping into the role of surgeon would have been a step down from this background. Doctors did not have the air of respectability that they have today. Lydgate wants to embrace medical reform in this provincial town. He's working in the tradition of Bichatian, who we have just mentioned, and he finds himself interested in public health, interested in establishing fever hospitals, and interested in preventing cholera. We learn that Lydgate is very skilled at diagnosing typhoid fever early on, something that couldn't have been said for many doctors at the time. Lydgate is incredibly averse to the common medical practices of the day, practices that would go on to be discredited in Eliot's lifetime. There's a little bit of dramatic irony here, because Lydgate is on the cusp of significant reforms and positive changes in how hospitals are run. We want to reach out at this point and say to him, keep going. This dramatic irony gives us a little taste of what it feels like to be at the forefront of anything. Change happens in a climate of stagnation, and obstacles arise when you question the status quo. And that isn't easy to deal with. It's difficult being ahead of one's time. Indeed, it's difficult changing the course of history and making your mark. Lydgate is averse to bleeding, a practice that you might recognise by its other name, bloodletting. This practice involved withdrawing a patient's blood so as to prevent or cure an illness, and was typically done with leeches. Bloodletting was based on an ancient system of medicine constructed according to the humours theory. Lydgate has little interest in this antiquated approach to medicine, though indeed today there are still circumstances in which this practice is deployed, though it's no longer based on the four humours theory. Lydgate favours more cutting-edge developments, such as the stethoscope, which was invented by René Laennec in 1816. We also see that Lydgate prefers to prescribe drugs rather than dispense them and take payment from druggists for doing so. And he has strong opinions on the importance of coroners having a medical rather than a legal background. Of course, this flies in the face of the old guard, whose coroner friends are lawyers. Why can't a coroner be a lawyer? Why can't we keep my old friend in his current position? Who is this young whippersnapper to come in here and try to disrupt things? These are the questions simmering beneath the surface of Book 2. Just so you have a sense of where exactly we are situated in history, specifically in the history of medicine, keep in mind that Lydgate is ahead of his time by at least 2 decades. The Act of 1858 meant that medical registration became compulsory and unqualified practitioners were outlawed. Lydgate is operating in a time where he is actually overqualified. His training in Paris means that if we today were to go back in time, and if we were to have the misfortune to fall ill, and we probably would fall ill, we would really want Lydgate to be the one treating us. But we would be unlikely to have such luck, and the doctor who would be treating us would have gained his position through means other than medical training. In the early 19th century, whilst other European countries were concerned with registering and regulating the training of medical practitioners, the United Kingdom didn't seem that fussed. Since the time of Henry VIII, the powers had been conferred on the College of Physicians and the Company of Surgeons to regulate London practitioners. Provincial practitioners only needed the approval of a bishop. And whilst some surgeons might have had an apprenticeship, they were under no obligation to do so. Keep in mind that the word bacteria only appeared in the language from 1847 onwards. Doctors didn't know what caused public outbreaks like cholera. Disease transmission in the early Victorian era was understood as a matter of inherited susceptibility and individual intemperance. In other words, your lifestyle. Now, that's pretty scary to contemplate, knowing what we now know. Doctors would often prescribe their patients to change their climate, to spend some time by the coast or in the countryside, thinking the air and water would cure them. This treatment was coupled with laxative purgation, application of leeches, and a healthy dose of prayer. If we look to the 1848 edition of Buchan's Domestic Medicine, we see its coloured frontispiece, which shows the symptoms of smallpox, scarlet fever, and measles, and the professed cause for these afflictions: night air, sedentary habits, anger, wet feet, and abrupt changes of temperature. The cause of fever was thought to include violent emotion, bad air, irregular bowels, and extreme temperature changes. Cholera, of which there would soon be an outbreak in London in 1854 as part of the 1846 to 1860 worldwide pandemic. Cholera was explained as being caused by rancid or putrid food, particularly cold fruits like cucumbers and melons. It was also thought to be caused by fear or anger. Dr. John Snow would demonstrate that the infection was actually being spread by contaminated water, specifically from a public pump in Soho. Removing the public handle resulted in the cholera subsiding. On the back of this, public health officials like Sir John Simon pushed forward projects to provide clean water separate sewage systems, rubbish removal, and legislating for improved housing, you can still visit that pump today, which remains as a memorial of this huge leap forward in thinking in the medical community. One of the main knock-on effects from this would be the inextricable linking of health and social reform from here on. One of the most important reforms in the 19th century actually takes place a little over a decade before the events of Middlemarch and 4 years before George Eliot was born. We're talking about the 1815 Apothecaries Act. This act made the Society of Apothecaries the main examining body of medicine and finally standardised training. This also meant that from the early 19th century on, medical professionals could be broadly divided into 3 branches: physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries, who would later become the general practitioners that we know today. This act required apothecaries to undertake a 5-year apprenticeship. It required holders of the licence of apothecaries to dispense the prescriptions of physicians and made the holding of such a licence compulsory for dispensing drugs. None of this covered surgery. Over the course of the 19th century, private schools established themselves near the famous London hospitals and would host anatomy dissection classes. Students would begin their education as apprentices and pay a fee to become a pupil, known as a dresser, to leading surgeons. Surgery was emerging from its primitive, medieval, and frankly downright terrifying past, and would make huge strides over the century to becoming the respected profession it is today. But it's important to keep in mind that Lydgate is a very special kind of literary hero. Up until this point, we have many novels with characters who are doctors, but they're not characters we look up to. We often encounter these dodgy doctors in Gothic horror novels, and they plug into the reader's fears of falling so ill that they require a trip to a butcher who will likely make them worse, if not kill them, intentionally or unintentionally. But Tertius Lydgate is one of the first, most glaring examples of literary hero who is a thoroughly applaudable medical professional. He is an admirable character and an early adopter of many of the groundbreaking medical practices that the world would feel as seismic shifts towards a more comprehensive understanding of public health. So, in chapter 13, the chapter that opens part 2, we learn that wealthy evangelical banker Mr. Bulstrode has agreed to fund Lydgate's fever hospital. The old infirmary lies in a Mr. Farebrother's parish, but Bulstrode wants a Mr. Tyke appointed chaplain for the new hospital. Lydgate professes no opinion on clerical matters, which is in keeping with Eliot's depiction of a society that was becoming increasingly secular. But Bulstrode urges Lydgate to vote at the meeting of the medical board and avoid all of his opponent's arguments to the contrary. We also get something of what we might call Lydgate's manifesto in his own words. You can see this on page 124 in the Penguin paperback edition. There are few things better worth the pains in a provincial town like this, said Lydgate. A fine fever hospital, in addition to the old infirmary, might be the nucleus of a medical school here, when once we get our medical reforms. And what would do more for medical education than the spread of such schools over the country? A born provincial man who has a grain of public spirit as well as a few ideas should do what he can to resist the rush of everything that is a little better than common towards London. Any valid professional aims may often find a freer, if not a richer field in the provinces. So we see that Lydgate is rather a complementary figure. His story is rather complementary to Dorothea Brooke's. It's no surprise that Eliot decided to weave them together and run them side by side. Lydgate is ambitious, he's idealistic, and he's incredibly driven as he enters this new phase in his life, a phase where he sees endless opportunity open to him there in the provinces. As many a young man and woman before him, Lydgate desires to change the world by changing the little area of the countryside that he finds himself in at the time. He wants this area to be a nucleus. This is a time, and indeed this time is still today, when London is the epicenter. London is the nucleus of change and reform. And anybody who has been raised in the provinces, anybody who has been raised some distance away from London, and indeed the further one gets away from London, the more irritating one can find this. A lot of issues stem from the fact that a lot of policies are very London-centric and do not apply to the provinces. So this is an incredibly idealistic and ambitious mindset at any time, not just in the first half of the 19th century, to make the provinces a nucleus. And this chapter ends with Lydgate leaving and Mr. Vincy entering, reminding us of the little hole that Fred has gotten into. So we get something of a refresher of the events that ended Book 1, and the story moves forward too. So we get a recap and some progress. Mr. Vincy, you'll recall, is brother-in-law to Bulstrode, brother to his sister, and we see he asks for a letter that his son Fred can show to Featherstone, saying that the rumours of him borrowing money against his future inheritance are untrue. We get a sense at the close of this chapter, and both men are aware of this, that their fates are intertwined. Indeed, all of our fates are intertwined, sometimes in obvious ways, sometimes not. Bulstrode is being, to use Mr. Vincy's words, tyrannical, with his playing bishop and banker everywhere. And now, if you haven't moved beyond Book 2 of Middlemarch yet, you might wish to quietly mark the impression you're getting of Mr. Bulstrode at this moment in time. We next learn more of Lydgate in chapter 15, a brilliant chapter ripe for rereading and tearing apart, and many critics believe this to be the very first chapter Eliot wrote. But Eliot has masterfully whetted our appetite for learning more about Lydgate, and will delay our gratification again, deciding to place us in company with Fred and Mary, and of course, Featherstone, in chapter 14. I see this as being a comical chapter, and indeed you might wish to pigeonhole the tone of each chapter, try to ascertain the theme, the overarching theme, and when you come to the end of a chapter, flip back to the start of that chapter, read the epigraph, the little poetic epigraph, and see if you can place it generically, thematically, in terms of sentiment and tone. There will be quite the literary kaleidoscope when you get to the end of the novel. When you get to the end of Book 2, flip back and run through the different chapters that have composed that second book and appreciate the variation in tone and theme. You will see that Middlemarch most certainly is an intricately woven web when you do this. And now this might not be as overt as it is in novels like Great Expectations, for example, by Charles Dickens. The joy, or one of the many joys of Great Expectations, is rifling through the chapters. One chapter's in the style of high society fiction, one chapter is rather sensationalist in tone. Eliot is incredibly subtle, but the more you read and reread, the more you tear Middlemarch apart, the more you place it under the microscope, the more you can enlarge her subtleties. Fred takes the letter from Bulstrode, because we learn that Bulstrode relents, and he does indeed write the letter. And Featherstone reads it aloud and is thoroughly disapproving and difficult all the way through. And I find this quite comical, and I think we do not sympathise with Featherstone. Maybe we feel an inkling of sympathy, King Lear-like perhaps, just for a moment, but then we realise that Featherstone is being thoroughly cruel and delighting in it. Whether he has cause or not is another matter. When it comes to Fred and when it comes to Mary Garth, we feel Fred's subservient irritation. He colours red at Featherstone, essentially making a mockery of him. And he colours red and we feel it. And I feel myself getting a little bit hot when I read this through. And we see him be cruel to Mary, who is looking after him. Now, one of the joys of this chapter, after Featherstone's got that out of his system, is watching Mary and Fred flirt. They enjoy a little flirtation together, and it's rather nice to see. You might add this to your file of your favourite flirtations in literature. I would place this alongside Beatrice and Benedict. You might place this with some of Jane Austen's iconic protagonists. We see that they expound on worldviews that seemingly place themselves from a quite far off position from one another. You think, how are they going to reconcile? How could they be together? Mary talks of being angry with the ways of the world, and she also launches something of an attack against Fred, who we could charitably describe as being rather idle. She says on page 137 in the Penguin paperback edition, "I think any hardship is better than pretending to do what one is paid for and never really doing it." And then she begins to criticise Fred for not doing his duty in life. And he says, well, my duty wasn't to be a clergyman. I wasn't cut out for being a clergyman any more than you were cut out for being a governess. But that's not Mary's point. Her point is you have some duty. Yes, she concedes it may not have been a clergyman, but you need to do something with your life. And Fred begins to feel rather wounded. And of course, we often do feel wounded when those we love hold a mirror up to ourselves, up to our actions. And he says, "You ought to have a little fellow feeling there, Mary." And here we get one of many delightful Eliotic phrasings that are housed in the mouths of her characters. Fellow feeling. We will encounter Lydgate with his own character distinctive phrasing, spots of commonness, and we will encounter Will Ladislaw to have his own too, with his phrase, fanaticism of sympathy. I love these phrasings, fellow feeling, spots of commonness, fanaticism of sympathy, and I would implore you to be on the lookout for your own. This is interesting because we will often hear a very specific wording when a character speaks, and then later hear Eliot's authorial intrusion using that word too. Did she get such wording from her character? Or did her characters get the wording from her? Of course, as writer, she is God in her novel, so we know they got the wording from her. But to what extent does Eliot want us to believe it's the other way around? To what extent is this deliberate? And what does it mean? On page 138, after Mary has revealed her knowledge, her experience of love to come from books, she catalogues the heroines of William Shakespeare and Sir Walter Scott, we get this wonderful exchange. Fred says, "When a man is not loved, it is no use for him to say that he could be a better fellow, could do anything. I mean, if he were sure of being loved in return." And Mary says, "Not of the least use in the world for him to say he could be better. Might, could, would, they are contemptible auxiliaries." Keep in mind that an auxiliary verb is a bit of a helping verb. An auxiliary verb allows us to use different tenses, moods and voices. Would, should, could, may, might, must, ought, these are all auxiliaries. And I don't know about you, but it really is quite a personal bugbear of mine. It's a little bit of a pet peeve when people use these words with me, these auxiliaries. And it's rather common, and I fall prey to it myself too. We all do. But anytime somebody uses one of these words, might, could, would, I feel like echoing Mary Garth and saying, They are contemptible auxiliaries. And what does she mean? Why are they so contemptible? Because if we say we could do something, the implication is that we are not doing it. It's a hypothetical. It's dependent on so many other things. I could do this, but... And the but is always, I won't because of this, that, and the other. The but is always due to our external locus of control. Not always, but almost always. I could do that, but I won't. The unsaid is, I won't. I would if it were not for. I would, but. I might do that. It's very wishy-washy. It's not definitive. These are not the words of a man or woman of action. It's not somebody who's cracking on with it. This is somebody who is malingering and they're being a little bit idle and they're not fulfilling their duty. And no, his duty doesn't have to be clergyman. His duty doesn't have to be what somebody else tells him it is, but it has to be something. You have to do something. Rather than sit around and say, oh, might, could, should, would. I think of Marlon Brando in On the Waterfront. I could have been a contender. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. So put a pin in that phrasing. Contemptible auxiliaries. These helping words which ultimately don't really help us at all, do they? Because we will see that phrasing again, but with a different character. Rosamond in chapter 16. And so the web comes more clearly into focus with every fine detail. Fred tells Mary that women don't love their men for their goodness, and we wonder, then what do they love them for? And we learn that Mary's concern with Fred is her father's concern. He is too idle, and he needs altering. She talks of altering. At least she hopes he will alter, rather than stagnate. Remember, this is the age of reform, and though this is a psychologically complex novel, and though George Eliot ostensibly professes to be rather realist, there is a mythical vein to this book, and there is a romantic vein, and there is a symbolic vein, an allegorical vein, running through Middlemarch. And Mary Garth's issue is, how can she have anything to do with a man romantically if he's not doing anything with his life? Ah, the age-old problem that women have come up against since the dawn of time and will continue to combat. Fred protests that the onus is on her to help him become better. He says, Mary, seizing her hand, if you will not give me some encouragement, I shall get worse instead of better. I will not give you any encouragement, said Mary, reddening. Your friends would dislike it, and so would mine. My father would think it a disgrace to me if I accepted a man who got into debt and would not work. And she's right, isn't she? She is right. And it's a fine line between enabling somebody, giving somebody some encouragement. Yes, I might marry you. Using one of those contemptible auxiliaries, I might marry you. It's a fine line between enabling behaviour and the Viktor Frankl idea of if we take man as he is, we make him worse, we degrade him. But if we take him as he truly could be, we promote him. So on the one hand, we want to be idealistic, don't we? And we're sentimental creatures at heart, even if we try to detach from our feeling and treat it rather scientifically like a specimen on a slide. But we've also got to be realistic. So that's one of the many balancing acts as we march a middle course through this novel. And let's go on to chapter 15, where we learn more about Lydgate. So Lydgate's back. We've had a little bit of a light interlude with Mary and Fred. And now we're treated to Lydgate's story, which Eliot says can be told without many words. Well, it turns out that many words are required, but it also turns out that we don't mind. It's not a particularly short story, but Lydgate's backstory is enthralling. I personally find it enthralling. I love this backstory. In chapter 15, we are reading a story within a story within a story, one that explicates Lydgate's character and the time of medical reform more thoroughly. Chapter 15 opens, and remember that this is the chapter Eliot most likely wrote before all others. When you come to reread it, keep that in your mind, that this could have been where she started, and you might read it a little bit differently. Chapter 15 opens with a concern on the part of George Eliot, a concern that she is belated. She uses that word, belated. She calls herself a belated historian, which is an interesting and, we might say, rather accurate choice of words. Two words could not be more pregnant with meaning. Is Eliot a historian in the same way that Victor Hugo professed himself to be a historian? We know that Hugo took quite a lot of poetic license with the facts that formed his poetic matter. We also know that he thought it prudent to do that, and he believed that history ultimately always comes full circle and lands in the domain of the writer, in his case a rather romantic writer. Eliot draws in Henry Fielding in the beginning of chapter 15. Henry Fielding, whose Tom Jones would have been an influential piece of imaginative fiction for her. And if you get a chance to rifle through it at any point, you might find it amusing to see just how overt Fielding's authorial voice is. If you think you can hear Eliot frequently, you will be surprised by Fielding. Eliot writes, and this is page 141 in the Penguin paperback classics edition. She writes, "A great historian, as he insisted on calling himself, who had the happiness to be dead 120 years ago, and so to take his place among the colossi, whose huge legs our living pettiness is observed to walk under, glories in his copious remarks and digressions as the least imitable part of his work, and especially in those initial chapters to the successive books of his history, where he seems to bring his armchair to the proscenium and chat with us in all the lusty ease of his fine English. But Fielding, and I love this, Fielding lived when the days were longer." This is the anxiety of being belated. And indeed, Harold Bloom might call this the anxiety of influence. Fielding, Eliot's aesthetic precursor, lived when the days were longer. Have you ever felt that? When you were reading a book before your time? Indeed, we're reading Middlemarch. We might think that during Eliot's time, the days were longer. For time, Eliot tells us, like money, is measured by our needs, when summer afternoons were spacious and the clock ticked slowly in the winter evenings. We, belated historians, must not linger after his example, and if we did so, it is probable that our chat would be thin and eager. And she says, I, at least, have so much to do in unravelling certain human lots and seeing how they were woven and interwoven, that all the light I can command must be concentrated on this particular web and not dispersed over that tempting range of relevancies called the universe. What an introduction to learning more about Lydgate. Eliot here is invoking the muse. You can tell that she was writing an epic at this time. She's invoking light that she brings forward, casts forward, light that will be now shining on the unravelling of certain human lots, seeing how they are woven and interwoven. The particular web that we are focusing on here is a brilliant opening to a chapter. And Eliot talks about how her character Lydgate at this point was simply a cluster of signs to his neighbours. And indeed, he is so for us too, until our author explains the signs. We will see, when we come to Dorothea, that there is an anxiety around symbolism, an anxiety about what something means or what something is supposed to signify. What is something supposed to connote? We're placed in an age of reform, not only in the medical sense, but in the artistic sense too. And reforms are rather like discoveries, big leaps composed of small leaps, huge tapestries woven together out of our individual threads. And here, in this chapter, the threads of Lydgate's character come together. Getting to know someone over the course of many years, an experience we seek to replicate with our staggered reading of Middlemarch following the original serialization. Getting to know someone is rather like experiencing a country in reform, unless, of course, they lay idle and stagnant. Lydgate wishes Middlemarch to be the nucleus. And in many ways, this small town is the nucleus. It is the centre of the world. And it's the centre of the world by being so firmly and thoroughly of its time and place, in much the same way that the Paris of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables is a microcosm for the entire world. Middlemarch is about ambition, or lack of ambition. Run through who we've been introduced to so far. We have Dorothea, overflowing with ambition, but needing to channel it. Casaubon, who has ambition without application, without passion. We might call it dry ambition. We have Fred, idle, lacking ambition, needing altering like a piece of fabric. We have Will Ladislaw, who has poetic ambition, creative ambition. And we have Lydgate, who has the ambition to reform, medical reform. And where did this passion, this ambition, spring from? Lydgate shows himself to have been a deep reader since childhood. And the moment of vocation, Eliot locates that. The moment of vocation struck him when he read a book about anatomy, specifically during a passage of the heart. And that is a curious metaphor, isn't it? His intellectual ambition sprung from the heart. We need heart to have ambition. We need feeling to reform. And we should remind ourselves that the meaning of passion, which goes hand in hand with ambition, passion as the sense of suffering for the cause we believe in. Christians talk of the passion of Christ, the crucifixion and the crown of thorns. We need passion, we need suffering if we are to have ambition, and we must channel that passion and we must channel that ambition. This idea of channeling, flowing energy is everywhere in Middlemarch when you know to look for it. We also see this idea of sublimation, which, like repression, was yet to have an entire religious, scientific, mystic, and yet credible school of thought built around it. We see the confluence of the sex drive, the romantic urges, love, and the urge to do good in the world, the urge to channel that drive into one's vocation. And we see that right after the passage describing Lydgate's discovery of himself in his vocation, when he first read about the heart, we see Eliot draw in a phrasing from King James I's treatise on poetry, talking of a woman's macdom and her fairness. What does that mean? If you look to page 144 and see the King James allusion, the quote, her macdom and her fairness, that means form and beauty. Form and beauty. Page 144, we are not afraid of telling over and over again how a man comes to fall in love with a woman and be wedded to her. It is due to excess of poetry or of stupidity that we never weary of describing what King James called a woman's macdom and her fairness, her form and beauty. Never weary of listening to the twanging of the old troubadour strings, and are comparatively uninterested in that other kind of macdom and fairness which must be wooed with industrious thought and patient renunciation of small desires. In the story of this passion too, the development varies. Sometimes it is the glorious marriage, sometimes frustration and final parting, and not seldom the catastrophe is bound up with the other passion sung by the troubadours. For in the multitude of middle-aged men who go about their vocations in a daily course determined for them, much in the same way as the tie of their cravats, there is always a good number who once meant to shape their own deeds and alter the world a little. The story of their coming to be shapen after the average and fit to be packed by the gross is hardly ever told, even in their consciousness. For perhaps their ardour in generous unpaid toil cooled as imperceptibly as the ardour of other youthful loves, till one day their earlier self walked in like a ghost in its old home and made the new furniture ghastly. Nothing in the world more subtle than the process of their gradual change. In the beginning, they inhaled it unknowingly. You and I may have sent some of our breath towards infecting them. When we uttered our conforming falsities or drew our silly conclusions, or perhaps it came with the vibrations from a woman's glance. This is rather tragic and it's rather ironic. There's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek aspect to Eliot's prose here, but it's also intensely astute when it comes to knowledge about the world and knowledge about ourselves and men, knowledge about how we lose our passion, how we lose our youthful energy. When we're young, we're brimming with energy and ambition, but it's kind of flowing in all directions. It's not channeled, it's not contained, it's not constructive, and it can very often end up destructive, and we can end up spinning our wheels. But then, as the world takes its effect upon us, and as you and I, Eliot draws us both in, as we, with our conforming falsities, infect these men and women of ambition, they get jaded, they get cynical, or indeed perhaps they find themselves more interested in their love interest. It's a great passage, it's really worth rereading. Form and beauty need balancing in all things, and most certainly in the arts. We can talk of Dionysian impulses, flowing, formless, like music. And we can also talk of the Apolline, structure, form, like in painting and pottery. Here, we learn of Lydgate's desire to shape deeds to come and alter the world to come. Can you see how, regardless of whose story is being told, Eliot threads in the same words, like leitmotifs in a musical piece? A novel itself is a blend of form and passion. What happens if we get an overflowing of passion and no form to contain it? We don't have great art, that's for sure. But if we have too much form and not enough passion, as we may see with Casaubon in particular, that's not good either. That's stifling, not only in one's vocation, but in one's romantic life too. Lydgate sees himself in a dark period, one that wants reform, and he has his heroes. Eliot, using Lydgate's consciousness, mentions Edward Jenner specifically, the man who discovered vaccination as we know it today, the father of immunisation. The first ever vaccination for smallpox was administered in 1796. Jenner introduced his findings to the Royal Society. The results were replicated, and the British government banned variolation, a more primitive, dangerous and ineffective form of vaccination. They banned it in 1840. Again, bear in mind that Lydgate is before this time too. It is not 1840 yet. Lydgate wants to be a node. That's his word. Great word. I love that word. He wants to be a node, and he wants to be a unit of change, making a link in the chain of discovery, which seems to me to be curiously Darwinian lexis. Again, Lydgate wouldn't have read The Origin of Species because it hadn't been published yet. But Eliot, of course, had read the seminal work. On page 147, we see the relatively recent Apothecaries Act of 1815 being discussed. Recent as in over a decade having elapsed. We see that Lydgate plans to start with a reform within his reach, acting stoutly on the strength of a recent legal action. That's the Apothecaries Act. So, we change the world by starting small, starting close to home, starting with a small reform already legally secured, and yet even that is liable to cause a bristled response. Adopting the style of a general practitioner in this provincial town, we learn, is likely to be felt as offensive criticism by his professional brethren. That's the thing. Reform, changing the world, is not as sexy in the real world as it is in our imagination. We'll see a disconnect between imagination, or fantasy, and reality with Dorothea too. Change often looks like pissing your neighbours off with something relatively small. It means risking ostracising oneself, and in reality, we may not all have the strength or fortitude to do that when it comes down to it. Sometimes we need to make compromises in the name of progress, and yet we still get a tone of idealism. In 1829, it's 1829, the dark territories of pathology are a fine America. That's from page 147. About 1829, the dark territories of pathology were a fine America for a spirited young adventurer. Lydgate was ambitious, above all, to contribute towards enlarging the scientific, rational basis of his profession. In a realist novel, the writer must give their characters the allusions, metaphors, similes, allegory, and symbolism. Middlemarch is deeply allegorical, in much the same way as Moby Dick. But Eliot gets away with writing a realist or psychological novel, rather than a visionary novel, by leaving the cryptic talk to her protagonists. Chapter 15 is really splendid, one of my favourite chapters. We learn that Lydgate, like Eliot herself, wants to break away from the beaten path. We learn that he is not exempt from his own character flaw. The recurring character flaw in Eliot's fiction is egoism. We're told, page 149 to 150, our vanities differ as our noses do. All conceit is not the same conceit, but varies in correspondence with the minutiae of mental make, in which one of us differs from another. Lydgate's conceit was of the arrogant sort, never simpering, never impertinent, but massive in its claims and benevolently contemptuous. We're told that Lydgate's spots of commonness lay in the complexion of his prejudices, which, in spite of noble intentions and sympathy, were half of them such as are found in ordinary men of the world. And on page 49, in introducing and elaborating upon Lydgate's character, Eliot tells us that character is a process and an unfolding, and I love that. Once again, I find myself needing to draw in Proust, who taught us that our social personalities are a creation of the thoughts of other people. We are a cluster of signs to our neighbours, and then we unfold outwards. And we develop, we unfold, and this unfolding metaphor, which is like a fabric metaphor, makes me think that there are some wrinkles that potentially need to be ironed out, potentially cannot be ironed out. You start off rather small, and your surface area enlarges, your influence enlarges. And the wrinkles, as you unfold, may mark key moments in our lives where we've had to wrestle with our conscience, wrestle with our proclivity to compromise to get where we need to be, our conceding of certain points, our moral wrestlings. So I love that. I love the idea that character is an unfolding. Anybody who's read voraciously, which is you and is me, will know that one of the most delightful and estranging parts of coming to a new fictional world is meeting a stranger and then halfway through the novel knowing who they are, getting to the end of the novel, feeling like you've known them forever, rereading the novel, now they're your friend. I love that. It's a real unfolding. And we also learn that Lydgate has two selves by virtue of his romantic background. Up until this point in literary history, the two selves of a doctor would be referring to the surface and the dark side. Here, It refers to Lydgate the lover and Lydgate the doctor. Both parts, though ostensibly split, we could say are webbed together, united by his egoism. I love how chapter 15 ends with a sense of resolve on Lydgate's part to take a scientific view of women, and how no one in Middlemarch knew his past. We feel as though we've been let in on a secret, don't we? Because we know a little something of his past. In chapter 16, we hear Eliot's authorial intrusion with her using Fred's words, fellow feeling, and giving her opinion on the characters as though they were real entities she were presiding over. And in effect, they are. What we see here as we enter the boardroom and enter Lydgate's consciousness in the run-up to the vote for either Mr. Tyke or Mr. Farebrother, what we are seeing is reform take place in miniature. We noted in Book 1, early on, when Mr. Brooke and Chetham and Dorothea and company are discussing matters of reform in a roundabout way, that this is what the individual rooms of a country look like during an age of reform. No wonder Dorothea wishes to design cottages. These rooms are very important. It's where we voice our opinions, our private opinions. It's where we first make ourselves heard to others and to ourselves. And some of us won't make ourselves heard, and some of us will never get beyond these closed doors. But private discourse can be public dissent. We vote in private and among ourselves. If there were an unjust war on, many rooms across the land may house men and women, their fathers and mothers, wrestling with the dissent they feel. And all of these small discussions, these various voting booths around the country, go towards change. It might not accelerate as much as we wish. Indeed, it might happen in a direction contrary to our wishes, but this is how it happens. And we learn about the compromises that we make as individuals, even with the best of intentions. We see that Mr. Bulstrode holds a sort of mob rule over the country. Here's the opening to chapter 16, page 155. The question whether Mr. Tyke should be appointed as salaried chaplain to the hospital was an exciting topic to the Middlemarchers, and Lydgate heard it discussed in a way that threw much light on the power exercised in the town by Mr. Bulstrode. The banker was evidently a ruler, but there was an opposition party, and even among his supporters, there were some who allowed it to be seen that their support was a compromise, and who frankly stated their impression that the general scheme of things, and especially the casualties of trade, required you to hold a candle to the devil. The casualties of the trade require us to hold a candle to the devil. Who is talking here? And there is another heaping of dramatic irony when we see the men discussing lancets and Wakeley. Hang your reforms, said Mr. Chichely, page 157. There's no greater humbug in the world. You never hear of a reform, but it means some trick to put in new men. I hope you are not one of the lancets men, Mr. Lydgate, wanting to take the coronership out of the hands of the legal profession. Your words appear to point that way. I disapprove of Wakeley, interposed Dr. Spragg. No man more. He's an ill-intentioned fellow who would sacrifice the respectability of the profession, which everybody knows depends on the London colleges, for the sake of getting some notoriety for himself. So Lancet's magazine was founded by Thomas Wakeley in 1823, who controversially put forward the view that a coroner should be medically rather than legally trained. The periodical would have found a revered status in Eliot's lifetime, but in Lydgate's lifetime, with all of this not being that many years old, it was still very much a contentious issue. Lydgate weighs in on why a medically trained man should be a coroner as opposed to a legally trained man when he says, "In my opinion, legal training only makes a man more incompetent in questions that require knowledge of another kind. People talk about evidence as if it could really be weighed in scales by a blind justice. No man can judge what is good evidence on any particular subject unless he knows that subject well. A lawyer is no better than an old woman at a post-mortem examination." And now we take this for granted, and so Lydgate makes a much more widely applicable point, or he can. We need to think about his rationale, his thinking in the abstract. How many of us would have sided with Lydgate at the time? We like to think we would, and to be honest, I think you and I would have sided with him. But many humans defer their thinking to the cognitive bias of tradition, rather than use reason to question why we do things. And that's understandable why we do that. It's uncomfortable. Change is uncomfortable. Probing and questioning is uncomfortable. We see now, in this instance, that the specifics here are correct, but can we apply the same reasoning power in the abstract to things that we take for granted today? We do this by examining the curious interplay between evidence, experience, empiricism. If we do so, we'll find ourselves going against the grain. We'll find ourselves rather scorned and thought to be rather silly. And we'll find that being ahead of one's time, again, isn't sexy. If we find ourselves ahead of our time, we may need to compromise. We may need to secure the friendship of a devilish banker. I find that Rosamond's appearance in chapter 16 is a nice break from the reform in miniature. She is like a musical interlude. She exudes melody, breaking up the scientific and political talk, so often necessarily converged, from the tuneless Middlemarch. Each character, as you've noticed, has a defining preoccupation. At this point in the novel, Rosamond seems to be woven out of music. And if this sounds for a second as though it is unrealistic, as though this is too much artifice, too much form, you might ponder over the people in your life and what you would define them by. I often find myself defined by myself and others by my books. And I know that many of you listening to this do that too. We learn a little bit about Rosamond just at the chapter's end, and by the virtue of being held slide-like up against Lydgate, we see those contemptible auxiliaries again, deployed rather differently this time around. And I would implore you to reread over the very end of chapter 16. We end with Rosamond in the Penguin paperback. That's the bottom of 165 through to 167. Here, we learn something about the unfolding of character and being a cluster of signs to one's neighbours. Because in Rosamond's romance, we're told, it's not necessary to imagine much about the inward life of the hero. She's not imagining Lydgate's inward life. The first thing she discerns is his good birth, which distinguishes him from all Middlemarch admirers. And Eliot tells us that our passions do not live apart in locked chambers, but, dressed in their small wardrobe of notions, bring their provisions to a common table and mess together, feeding out of the common store according to their appetite. And this is where we get the contemptible auxiliaries brought in. Rosamond was entirely occupied, not exactly with Tertius Lydgate, as he was in himself, but with his relation to her. And aren't we all? Are we ever occupied with someone in and of themselves? Do we ever probe inwardly? Sometimes we do, but not always, and not everybody. Very often, people are occupied with or preoccupied with another insofar as they have any effect on them, their relation. We understand others by their relation to us or their relation to the world, generally. And it was excusable in a girl, we're told, who was accustomed to hear that all young men might, could, would be, or actually were in love with her, to believe at once that Lydgate could be no exception. This is how a web is constructed, delicately indelibly, inextricably, subtly, and discernible from instinct, but only viewable from great distance and with great scrutiny, like putting it under a microscope. And indeed, I would implore you to put more passages under a microscope, pull in and out of focus with Middlemarch, see it from a great height, and then zoom right in and see what you might discover. Now, we're restraining ourselves from indulging in too much talk about Rosamond just at this moment, and for those who received an advanced reading copy of Middlemarch, I would say take care to refrain from spoilers, but for those first readers, I would ask that you put a pin in your impressions of Rosamond and her relation to Lydgate, though we have brought in a musical metaphor to describe her. We might wonder if there could truly be a sense of harmony between the two. Are her ideas about marriage and men conducive to a harmonious union? Note your impressions now, and as first reader, you can comfort yourself with the knowledge that you are in company with hordes of readers all over the land who are waiting for each new instalment with bated breath. At this point in the story, we have a couple and potential couples, and readers across the country would be speculating on how each of these relationships might develop. And you may find that Eliot, being ever the masterful writer, is planning to take us off the beaten path again and subvert our expectations. From chapter 17 to 18, we see that Lydgate rather likes Farebrother. And so do we. Lydgate says, page 174, "Don't you think men overrate the necessity for humouring everybody's nonsense till they get despised by the very fools they humour?" He says this to Mr. Farebrother. "The shortest way is to make your value felt, so that people must put up with you, whether you flatter them or not." Lydgate is being rather idealistic here, and as we've already read through Book 2, we know that there's a sense of irony here to his words, although there will be soon enough. Farebrother, on the other hand, kind of knows how the small towns work. He knows how Middlemarch works. He knows how it goes. He knows the rules of the game. He knows how society operates. And he warns Lydgate that if he doesn't vote for Tyke, he's effectively making an enemy of Bulstrode. "If you vote for me, you will offend Bulstrode." "What is there against Bulstrode?" said Lydgate emphatically. "I did not say there was anything against him except that. If you vote against him, you will make him your enemy." And he says, well, look, if you are going to make that compromise, and if you're going to keep Bulstrode as a friend, you must know that I myself, Mr. Farebrother, I'm not going to take offence at that. You won't offend me. I don't translate my own convenience into other people's duties. I'm opposed to Bulstrode in many ways. I don't like the set he belongs to. They're a narrow, ignorant set, and do more to make their neighbours uncomfortable than to make them better. Their system is a sort of worldly, spiritual cliquism. And so at this point, we're wondering how Lydgate is going to vote exactly. And over the course of chapter 18, we see Lydgate wrestle with his conscience. And as the deciding vote lands with him, we see him concede. We're told Lydgate did not like the consciousness that in voting for Tyke, he should be voting on the side obviously convenient for himself. For the first time, Lydgate was feeling the hampering, thread-like pressure of small social conditions and their frustrating complexity. And so he votes for Tyke, and we see that the petty medium of Middlemarch had been too strong for him. We see that the sway of the small town mentality is too overbearing for Lydgate, and he succumbs, making his deal with the devil, and we feel his anguish. Then, right at that decisive moment, Eliot, ever at ease, ever forcing us to delay our gratification, finally takes us to reunite with Dorothea and Casaubon. What's the effect of waiting this long to see Dorothea and Casaubon? To me, it almost feels like the exact amount of time that would have elapsed with them gone on their honeymoon. We get a sense of them away from Middlemarch. Then we get an intimate peep into their disappointed honeymoon. This is one of the reasons why following the serialized publication is so rewarding. It's a way of interacting with the text, feeling its sense of time, and it brings new meaning to the characters and what they're going through. And chapter 19, which we could retitle, we could call it Form versus Idea. That would have my vote for thematic titling. This chapter doesn't open immediately with Dorothea, but with Will Ladislaw, second cousin to Casaubon, not uncle. He goes to great pains to ensure that is understood. And we start to learn more about this character too, indirectly, through his conversation with his artist friend first, and then with Dorothea. These chapters might remind one of the scenes in Anna Karenina, where Anna and Vronsky go to Italy. And it will come as no surprise that Tolstoy likes Eliot a great deal. He had Middlemarch on his personal bookshelf and used her as a model for the English novel. Anna and Vronsky in Italy is one of my favourite parts of that novel, and Dorothea and Casaubon in Italy is one of my favourite parts of this novel. I personally love spending time with Dorothea and Casaubon and Will in Italy, even though we are effectively witnessing the crumbling of a marriage before it's even started. Readers will find themselves drawn to one narrative arc over another, and where you find yourself drawn will be revealing of your own background. If you have a medical background, a scientific or logical background, you might find yourself drawn to the Lydgate arc. Whereas if you studied any of the humanities, if you love art and music, you might be drawn to the chapters spent with Dorothea in Italy. I find myself drawn to these chapters, although I do enjoy spending time with Lydgate. Regardless of where you find yourself pulled, both sections require explication. We can more fully appreciate Lydgate as an early adopter of reform by grounding his movements in history, learning when the first vaccination was, when bacteria came into the language, and what the common medical practices were at the time. All of this is really useful, and we need to do the same with the aesthetic tradition so as to increase our appreciation and understanding of the final chapters of Book 2. Middlemarch is a study of provincial life, and Eliot can be rather clinically analytical, but she also has great feeling to go alongside her analytical prowess. We know from her journals that Eliot was a frequent concert goer, Haydn, Mozart. She loved the German classical and romantic composers. We know she appreciated Wagner and Liszt. And we also know that she was a great appreciator of paintings, like those of the neoclassical Frederick Leighton, who would illustrate Romola, Eliot's fourth novel. You can see Leighton's paintings here. Leighton, who associated with the Pre-Raphaelites, who were, as you know, concerned with artistic reform in much the same way that Lydgate was concerned with medical reform, and Leighton even designed the tomb of Elizabeth Barrett Browning for Robert Browning in Florence. His muse was the tales of ancient Greek mythology, his style sensuous, and tone often erotic. In the 19th century, we witness a shift from utilising metaphors concerning the plastic and visual arts to utilising musical metaphors so as to better understand the written arts, poetry, novels and so forth. We can see that Eliot consistently uses the great music of Western Europe to explore the moral and emotional development of her characters. So not only does the music become a framework for comprehending the power of literature and what literature seeks, but it's also a great framework for understanding our development, our unfolding as thinking and feeling human beings. Both sides of that coin are explored with equal weight and emphasis in Middlemarch, thinking and feeling and the interplay between them. Music was seen as an overflowing of the human spirit in a way that the Romantic poets sought to emulate. Matthew Arnold, art critic and poet who, one might say, only had one great poem, Dover Beach, he called the mid-19th century an unpoetical age. Today we read the Victorians and we find ourselves rather obsessed with their sentiment. the sense of restraint. We find ourselves returning to them. But for one living during the time, there was a sense that the age of Victoria was a rather boring one when considered in light of what came before. Yes, we have the age of reform, we have wide-scale socio-political change across the land, to the point where the country at the beginning of the 19th century, England, is quite emphatically not the same country by the end of the century. But we have a sense that some of the restraint, some of the quiet that the Victorian writers sought, some of the humdrum, some of the banality that they wanted, was perhaps, and this could be a reduction, but perhaps they were seeking a rest from unrest. Remember that at the end of the previous century, we have the reign of terror across the Channel and the fear of revolution coming to England. We have the Napoleonic Wars, and the Victorians, who could remember this period, perhaps they had quite enough excitement for one lifetime. Quite enough excitement, thank you very much. Now, I'm not sure if I agree with Arnold that this was an unpoetical age. I think the poetry took a rather different form, or we could say it reformed. This tension between form and passion, form and beauty, form and soul is no coincidence in Middlemarch. When we talk about form, we must inevitably at some point talk about reforming. This was the century where we really see writers like Eliot, Tolstoy, Flaubert seek realism. When Arnold says the age is unpoetical, is he perhaps lamenting that we're no longer in the days of Keats and Shelley and Wordsworth? Their influence from their lifetime on will undoubtedly be felt, but writers like Eliot needed to find a new way off the well-beaten path. Up until the mid-19th century, the bourgeois continued to view paintings from the Dutch masters of the 17th century, and they were enjoying the fiction of the 18th century, novels like Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, which we'll be deep reading together. Great book, one of my favourites. Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, which explored the inner psychology of a character about as thoroughly as a writer ever possibly could. But mid-century, writers began to respond to the rapidly changing scientific, industrial and reform-filled landscape with a new approach. They had a new aim with art. Gustave Flaubert puts it best. Flaubert, whose 1857 Madame Bovary is textbook early realism. He puts it best when he says his aim is to give a truthful, objective and impartial representation of the world based on meticulous observation of contemporary life. Flaubert knew that the old rules were being thrown out, and he was in the process of demolition to make way for the new. We see in Adam Bede that Eliot's aim was to give a faithful account of men and things as they have mirrored themselves in my mind. So there's a little bit of a caveat there, isn't there, with Eliot? A faithful account of men and things as they have mirrored themselves in my mind. And Eliot says the mirror is doubtless defective. The outlines will sometimes be disturbed, the reflection faint or confused, but I feel as much bound to tell you as precisely as I can what that reflection is, as if I were in the witness box narrating my experience on oath. Art as mirror was a well-established metaphor. What was changing over the course of the Romantic period, and which would have its influence felt on the Victorian and realist writers to come, was the idea of the mirror being defective, selective, or more reflective of one's inner life than a faithful representation of reality. Let's consider a few common metaphors of expression for the Romantics when it came to art and the mind. Wordsworth talks of poetry being a spontaneous overflow, which would imply that the poet or the writer is a vessel, or perhaps a fountain. Lord Byron prefers a volcanic analogy. For Byron, poetry is the lava of the imagination, whose eruption prevents an earthquake. Byron also saw poetry as being akin to childbirth. And in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, he writes that we endow with form our fancy. This is an idea that we're still obsessed with today, and our touching upon form versus beauty already exemplifies. We endow with form Our fancy, that's interesting, isn't it? Our inner life, our imagination, precedes the act of creation, and acts of creation are making the internal external. There is much talk with Will Ladislaw about the German thinkers, and he has some sport at Casaubon's expense for not reading the German thinkers. The fact that Casaubon is forging on ahead with his work without having read the German thinkers means that his work is going to be redundant. He is not caught up with contemporary thinking. John Stuart Mill, writing on descriptive poetry, says that the description is of things as they appear, not as they are. Mill talks of an uttering forth of feeling, and John Keble asserts that poetry is personal catharsis rather than Aristotelian mimesis. What does that mean? It means that poetry is not simply representing. It's more akin to purging something inside us or reflecting our inward, not the world's outward, or painting the world's outward by virtue of what our inner brings to it. And romantic critical thought on poetry makes sure that we know the confluence between poetry and music. There is a confluence. Hazlitt said that poetry is the music of language, expressing the music of the mind. Shelley said that poetry is the expression of imagination. Coleridge said that poetry has intellectual purposes. And Hunt called poetry the utterance of a passion for truth, beauty, and power. The Romantics had begun to see that poetry about nature, for example, was not a reflection of the trees or the mountains, but rather, as German poet Ludwig Tieck says, it's a reflection of my spirit, my mood, which governs me just at this moment. And why do we see the emerging parallel of music's affinity with poetry rather than painting? Because music was already seen as non-mimetic, whereas painting was seen primarily as representative. Abstract art wouldn't become a thing until cameras, photography, and film would make realism somewhat redundant. Hazlitt tells us that poetry is the music of language, answering to the music of the mind, and there is a near connection between music and deep-rooted passion. Mad people sing. For a deep appreciation of the metaphors of art and the mind, I would highly recommend M.H. Abrams's The Mirror and the Lamp. Abrams talks about the favourite romantic toy, which is the Aeolian lyre, a popular piece of household furniture from the 18th to the 19th century. And we see Shelley talk of man as being a lyre, an instrument in which external and internal impressions play the notes. We have long had the analogy of the mirror when talking about art, but Hazlitt brings in the analogy of the lamp. A mirror can only reflect what's presented to one in one direction, whereas, quoting Abrams, combining the lamp with the mirror demonstrates that a poet reflects a world already bathed in an emotional light he himself projected. Art is the mediator between man and nature. We might draw in the idea of the sublime too, which exists beyond individuals, something that great writers plug into so as to transcend themselves. So, romantic poetry is not a faithful record or reflection of things, but rather things that are bathed in our feelings, which project a light onto objects. These shifting metaphors from mirror to lamp and fountain in the Romantic movement attest to much larger shifts in thought across the Romantic period in regards to epistemological thought. Epistemology meaning philosophy concerned with knowledge. The questions that we're really wanting answers to are, what is the mind? And what is the mind's relation to nature? John Locke, father of English empiricism and the kind of man Dorothea wishes, hopes Casaubon to be, Locke, in his essays, stated his belief that the mind is like a mirror that fixes the objects it reflects. The mind is, in essence, tabula rasa, a blank slate upon which sense impressions write or paint themselves. We could also say that the mind is a camera obscura, where light enters through a small aperture and throws an image of the external scene onto the wall. Here's Locke. Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. In that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. Before Locke, we thought we knew things a priori, which means knowledge that precedes theoretical deduction. But Locke saw all of our ideas as deriving from either sensation or perception. None of our knowledge comes before experience. And if this seems obvious now, keep in mind that this was a bold belief to put forward at the time. Wordsworth and Coleridge, fathers of Romanticism, see the mind as active participant, not passive, active in creating the world around them. And what I believe we're seeing here is a bird's eye view of our emerging consciousness as a species. This was the burden that the Victorians were given. This is what the realist writers were attempting to assimilate. This was their inheritance. And we cannot hope to understand realism and beyond. And when we say beyond, I suppose, for want of a better term, we are referring to modernism and postmodernism. We cannot hope to begin our understanding of more recent wrestles with consciousness until we know where we came from, where we marched on after the Enlightenment. Hopefully some of this background will make your reading of the final chapters of Book 2 fruitful. When Will's artist friend, Naumann, describes Miss Brooke, Ms. Second Cousin, as antique form animated by Christian sentiment, that means something. It's less a faithful descriptor of Dorothea, though it is very much astute and is faithful, but it's more indicative of a larger strain of thought running through Europe at the time, off the back of the Romantic era. If we find ourselves wondering why we even need these questions, these metaphors, these analogues for art and the mind, mirror and lamp and fountain, we might wish to contemplate that this actually comes from a need for self-preservation, a need to understand what we are, where we are, and indeed, if there is anything else. We are still crippled today by a certain Cartesian anxiety, whereby we clamour to establish our existence by virtue of our thoughts. Look at the dialogue between Will and Naumann. Wonderful dialogue, again exemplifying the great conversations of an entire era. This is page 191. Will says, I do not think that all the universe is straining towards the obscure significance of your pictures. And Naumann says, but it is, my dear, so far as it is straining through me. That stands firm. See now, my existence presupposes the existence of the whole universe, does it not? And my function is to paint. And they both go on to have a friendly discourse on which of the art forms are the greatest. This is a conversation that we never tire of having. Will protests that language is a finer medium than painting, and Naumann says yes for those who can't paint. But Ladislaw says language gives a fuller image, which is all the better for being vague. After all, the true seeing is within, and painting stares at you with an insistent imperfection. I feel that especially about representations of women, as if a woman were a mere coloured superficies. You must wait for movement and tone. There is a difference in their very breathing. They change from moment to moment. This woman, who you have just seen, for example, how would you paint her voice, pray? But her voice is much diviner than anything you have seen of her. So you can see why there are shifting metaphors, shifting away from trying to understand language through the visual mediums and seeing it in terms of music. All art constantly aspires to the condition of music, says Walter Pater. This was the conversation happening at the same time as all the conversations of reform across the country. And we know that all of this talk is really about our position in the world. We're talking about art, and we're talking about our function and art's function, and we are using others to understand ourselves. And because Eliot is a masterful writer, we might forget for a moment that we are not in the company of two real people having a discussion about art, but they are expressions of art in themselves. And it's interesting to see Will's consciousness. In addition to this idea of character as unfolding, we see this idea of characters colliding, and once again, character as node. He wonders, why was he making any fuss about Mrs. Casaubon? And yet he felt as if something had happened to him with regard to her. There are characters which are continually creating collisions and nodes for themselves in dramas, which nobody is prepared to act with them. Their susceptibilities will clash against objects that remain innocently quiet. And with that word node, we see an intrusion of the scientific world into the world of feeling and aesthetics, just as the world of feeling intrudes into the world of science. Chapter 20 onwards, and we're back with the disillusioned Dorothea in a heartbreaking part of the book. Dorothea is in Italy and experiencing a loss of innocence. I can think of few other novels that so expertly reproduce the feeling of moving from a state of idealism and fantasy to a state of suddenly having the real world rudely crashing down on you. What artist has so better rendered in language the feeling of disillusionment, the feeling of, we might say, maturity? You might wish to reread the opening of chapter 20, but put the poems of Robert Browning side by side with Eliot's passages. If you're in the mood for some poetry appreciation, I would particularly recommend you source out Robert Browning's Two in the Campagna, Andrea del Sarto, and A Toccata of Galuppi's. Browning was happily married and loved being an Englishman abroad in Italy, his second home. We see, unfortunately, however, that Dorothea's life with Casaubon is simultaneously no Robert Browning poem, and simultaneously, and quite scarily, very much a Robert Browning poem. And though they both become subjects for a painting in this final portion of Book 2, their life is no painting. On page 194, we see the new real future dawn upon Dorothea and begin to displace her imaginary future life. We're told that Dorothea's inward amazement was not anything exceptional. Many souls in their young nudity are tumbled out among incongruities and left to find their feet among them, while their elders go about their business. Nor can I suppose that when Mrs. Casaubon is discovered in a fit of weeping 6 weeks after her wedding, the situation will be regarded as tragic. Some discouragement, some faintness of heart at the new real future which replaces the imaginary is not unusual, and we do not expect people to be deeply moved by what is not unusual. We're told that the new real future was replacing the imaginary. And perhaps the age gap is partly responsible for this crisis. Dorothea and Casaubon are in two different stages of their lives, with the Reverend seemingly resistant to his new young bride's help, and she in disbelief that he is, we gather from her point of view, dragging his feet. Casaubon isn't that old, objectively speaking, and certainly by today's standards. He's only in his late 40s, but he hasn't aged well, and we might think him to be an old soul. The way everybody talks about him, he might as well be twice that age and still not holding himself gracefully. And the benefit of a young woman marrying a man who's much older than her, the benefit that Dorothea wanted to receive, expected to receive, was a little bit of guidance by someone who is in a later stage of life. A little bit of guidance is what she wanted, and she realises that this man, who is much older than her, is the one who needs the guidance, and he is not holding up his end of the bargain, an invisible bargain that I think she believed she was getting into. And they had perhaps a rather quick courtship, and a courtship built on idealism. She didn't really know Casaubon. She just had an ideal, construction of what she thought he was. So what she was seeing was a reflection of her own mind. It wasn't the thing itself. So it's this romantic preoccupation again. The mirror, the lamp, this idea of a lamp inside of us, our inner light, shining and projecting onto the world around us. What people are, who they unfold and who they become, is very much dependent on what we bring, our assumptions, how we view them. It's so important. That's why we continuously get this language of nodes and webs and weaving, and colliding. We're all connected. Now, obviously, we would rather be woven than experience a collision, but sometimes we can't help it. And so she had a very quick courtship with a man who she knew only by virtue of what she imposed upon him. And we can't blame her. We can't blame her. Dorothea Brooke is a nice young lady, but she's a little bit naive, and she is coming to terms with that now. And she's realising at this honeymoon period where you're supposed to be infatuated, you're supposed to be in love, you're supposed to be passionate. And she realises that this is not the man I thought I was marrying. See, there's no passion there. There's no attraction there, not really. And she's getting a bit of a rude awakening, and I think we feel really sorry for her at this point in the novel. And this is something that I think perhaps many people can identify with. This idea of imposing what you want a person to be upon that person. Even today, people get into a courtship and they do not see who that person is until much later down the line. They only see who they want them to be, the idealised version of them. And that's not great for either party. That's not great for the one doing the idealising, and it's not great for the person who's become pedestaled. We see the final chapters of Old and Young are quite the damning indictment of courtship, or failed courtship, or courtship based on our idealised version of somebody. Their discourse with one another, how Dorothea and Casaubon talk to one another, is not very loving. It's very passive. It's very icy. He's concerned with collecting notes, annotating, going to the Vatican and reading about his subject matter. He talks about paintings, if indeed he does talk about them, in a very dry and detached and dispassionate way, prompting Dorothea to say, but do you care about them? He's talking about these Italian frescoes, and she's saying, but do you care about them? And I suppose what she's saying there is, do you care about me? And he gives some very dry, dull, dusty annotation in speech about them, which isn't what she was expecting. She wants a little bit of passion from this man. This kind of answer, we're told, page 197, given in a measured official tone, as of a clergyman reading according to the rubric, did not help to justify the glories of the eternal city, or to give her the hope that if she knew more about them, the world would be joyously illuminated for her. There is hardly any contact more depressing to a young ardent creature than that of a mind in which years full of knowledge seem to have issued in a blank absence of interest or sympathy. She's in this romantic city. She's abroad. She's in Italy. There's art. There's great architecture. Yeah? And she's with the man she's married. And he's much older. And she's seen all this beautiful art. And he's not helping her understand why she should appreciate it. And he should be doing that. From her point of view, he should be doing that. And it's a heartbreak. I feel like this is a very heartbreaking part of the book. And we see that who we are really depends on who we're in contact with, who we're connected to, like nodes. It's really, really important. It's really important. And one moment, because of who she's connected to, she, we're told, takes the form, the shape of a cruel accuser. Remember that the word Satan comes from the Hebrew, which means accuser. Something I like to keep in mind whenever I find myself accusing or being accusative of somebody, which is not often, but we all do it from time to time, to remind oneself that accusing, etymologically speaking at the very least, is tied up with this idea of Satan. So one moment, because of who she's connected with, she's seen as an accuser. She's seen as a spy, this young bride. And then the very next chapter, she tries valiantly to be his helpmate. Yeah, helpmate is a word that comes from the Old Testament. Helpmate, helpmeet, yeah, talking about Adam and Eve. So we see how hopelessly dependent we are on other people for our own unfolding, our own development. Who we associate with is so important, whether we unfold or not. And what we find is something of a flirtation is beginning to develop between Dorothea and Will. And we get the sense that Casaubon is cottoning onto it a little bit. He doesn't like this. Will thinks Dorothea's great. And he thinks, what is she doing married to Casaubon? What on earth is she doing with him? And Dorothea likes his company too. And she likes his company because he has passion. Yeah, he loves art and he can explicate it. He can talk about what everything signifies in stark terms. And she apologizes to him for offending him when she spoke about his art. And she basically says it was because I'm ignorant. I didn't know what the art, I didn't know it was good. I need to learn. Someone needs to teach me about art. She says that was my ignorance. She says to Will, I must have said so, this is page 206, only because I never could see any beauty in the pictures which my uncle told me all the judges thought very fine, and I have gone about with just the same ignorance in Rome. There are comparatively few paintings that I can really enjoy. At first, when I enter a room where the walls are covered with frescoes or with rare pictures, I feel a kind of awe, like a child present at great ceremonies where there are grand robes and processions. I feel myself in the presence of some higher life than my own, but when I begin to examine the pictures one by one, the life goes out of them, or else is something violent and strange to me. It must be my own dullness. I am seeing so much all at once and not understanding half of it. That always makes one feel stupid. It is painful to be told that anything is very fine and not be able to feel that it is fine. Something like being blind while people talk of the sky. And Will goes on to explain that art is an old language with lots of affected styles. And there is a way of reading these paintings and deriving some enjoyment out of them. And he begins to give her the kind of crash course, the kind of education in feeling and art and sentiment and life, this passionate education. He gives her what she needs, or begins to. And he starts essentially tutoring her in the ways of the world and the ways of oneself and the ways of feeling and how to decipher these enigmas, these paintings. Dorothea and Will connect on an emotional level. Page 219, Dorothea says, I suppose I'm dull about many things. I should like to make life beautiful. I mean everybody's life. And then all this immense expense of art that seems somehow to lie outside life and make it no better for the world pains one. It spoils my enjoyment of anything when I am made to think that most people are shut out from it. And Will says in a beautiful, beautiful passage, I call that the fanaticism of sympathy. You might say the same of landscape, of poetry, of all refinement. If you carried it out, you ought to be miserable in your own goodness and turn evil, that you might have no advantage over others. The best piety is to enjoy when you can. You are doing the most, then, to save the Earth's character as an agreeable planet, and enjoyment radiates. It is of no use to try and take care of all the world. That is being taken care of when you feel delight in art or in anything else. And all the while, whilst their connection develops their spiritual and emotional connection with one another. All the while, Casaubon is busying himself with what we come to see as being rather pointless work. He is simply annotating, he's note-taking, and he's doing nothing to advance his key to all mythologies. And this key to all mythologies is a head nod, I believe, to Jacob Bryant's A New System, his analysis of ancient mythology. And Bryant believed that all mythology came from the Hebrew scripture, and he set out in his books to link all of the world mythologies together and trace them back to Genesis. And Casaubon is trying to do something rather similar. And it's interesting that he's averse to this idea of being idle or not knowing your vocation, because what he's doing is something that, again, many of us might fall prey to from time to time. We're hiding ourselves away in busyness. We can often be procrastinating the hardest when we seem the busiest. And so we see Casaubon continues to dispassionately collect his notes and get no further towards completing what should be his magnum opus. We end Book 2 by relishing something that Will says to Dorothea, something rather romantic. He's talking about what it means to be a poet. He says to be a poet is to have a soul so quick to discern that no shade of quality escapes it, and so quick to feel that discernment is but a hand playing with finely ordered variety on the chords of emotion, a soul in which knowledge passes instantaneously into feeling. And then he goes on to say, in response to Dorothea, who protests that she could never write a poem, he says to her, "You are a poem." And that is to be the best part of a poet. Now, how do you feel about that? Will telling Dorothea that she is a poem. And if he's a poet, what are the implications there? And we will leave it there for today. The great thing about Middlemarch is just how endlessly it can be discussed. We can go on reading it and rereading it, thinking about it, talking about it endlessly. And we can talk about it for hours and hours and hours. And there is always so much more to say about it. And that is evidence for Eliot being a great writer. It's evidence for Middlemarch being a great book. Great literature is inexhaustible. The more a work is inexhaustible, the greater it is. Book 3 would come out in April of 1872. Book 3 called Waiting for Death. And if you have the Penguin paperbacks edition, that runs from page 227 through to 321. So again, first readers would have to wait a little bit of time to see what happens next. Indeed, if you are being that first reader, then let us know what you think is going to happen next. What do you expect going into that third book? What are you looking forward to? What do you want to read more about? And if you are a rereader, if you're one of those lucky readers who have got your hands on an advanced reading copy from George Eliot, let us know which part of Book 2 you relished again. Which part do you return to again and again, and why? Thank you very much for listening today. Thank you very much for reading along. It's so lovely having us all read along as a group together. And hopefully you're falling as deeply in love with Middlemarch as I have. Have a lovely day, happy reading, and look forward to the next book.